Okay, Pascal, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I've honestly, I've written down so many questions. This question and answer session is going to go on for about 4 hours unless we're careful. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us again today. It's great to see you. We've shared a stage, obviously, a few times over the pre-pandemic world, so now we get to share a screen. So, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Ken. It's
Good.
amazing to be here. But yeah, I hope one day I'll be able to share a stage again with you very
Yeah,
soon.
and hopefully you'll be able to get back to China. So I mean, you've lived, as you said in your bio, you've spent so much time in both places, in China and in Silicon Valley, which I think it's unusual to find people who have an understanding of technology innovation from both those cultures. So let's start with that, 'cause I'm curious to ask you, if you look at the main difference between what happened in Silicon Valley and the way they do innovation, and culturally, and how
Mhm.
China do innovation, what is the main difference? And like, why is China winning the race in terms of innovation and technology, as you said?
Yeah, I mean, China's winning the race. I mean, in some fashion, I believe that because they are more apt to change. I think Silicon Valley, and if we go back 20 years ago, 2001, I actually moved to Silicon Valley. I had stayed some years in China before that, and my big dream was actually to go to Silicon Valley because I felt back then, 20 years ago, that China, it wasn't really moving. There wasn't really much happening. It was very
Yeah.
political. I mean, you didn't feel the vibes that you had from Silicon Valley. So I actually moved because I saw all that. I mean, that technology innovation, there's entrepreneurs, a real culture. And I think back then there's a few things that Silicon Valley did extremely well, which China copied in a way. And that's, first of all, they created a market, which China didn't have back then. And US always had a big market, lots of talent with universities and so on. And then the infrastructure, a lot of regulations that helped it. So this whole culture that Silicon Valley has, the pay it forward culture, like we call it, to
Yeah.
help others to get bootstrapped is something that China did not have 20 years ago. They copied all of it, including the talent, including the capital, including the market. They now have all that. But what is China's doing different at that time, because they didn't have it, this was the speed of change. It was
Okay.
because actually they had to localize their products, their offering for consumers that weren't aware of what was happening in the rest of the world, which means they started building different products than the ones they copied because the local consumer was asking for something much more pragmatic, much more practical, much more to do about his life. And so you
Yeah.
started seeing that this customer centricity, which we talk about a lot now, 20 years later, is something that China learned bottom up. They had to, otherwise they wouldn't survive. And
And if
that's, yeah,
and if your perception clearly is that they have leapfrogged and they intend to, and you were
yeah,
very clear there, 2030, they've put their own flag in the sand and they've said, we will
true.
be the global leaders in innovation. And I think I agree with you. If they say it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen. So if we accept they've leapfrogged where Silicon Valley maybe were 20 years ago now, there's a question actually from the platform here from Oliver, and he says, can the West leapfrog China back? Or has globalization made that impossible? Like, can we take the West back? Can we learn from what China have done, as they did from Silicon Valley, and can we flip it around again?
Definitely. The question is, do we want to learn from China? And
Okay.
that's the big question that many people have been asking the last years. Because I think, first of all, you need to somehow trust China to be able to learn from it. If you don't trust someone, it's hard to learn from it. But those entrepreneurs that actually feel and see the benefit, they fly to China, they try to start building drones or robots, and they learn very quickly how that goes, and they take that back to Silicon Valley. I think the blend of the two is the real power. And I believe that we still, and I put that in the presentation as well, still are very good in certain things like the
Yeah.
efficiency and agility and not agility, but I mean the process and the strategy and so on. And so blending those two is what is important. And the way to get back to China, or basically leapfrog ahead of China, is to not forget what we have done well, but learn from what they are doing very well right
Yeah.
now.
Okay. And this is a DIY Global Summit forum. So let's get into DIY. I don't know anything about the DIY industry in China. I don't know how much you know about the DIY industry in China. You're
A
a
little bit.
sinologist, but you're not a DIY sinologist.
No.
So tell us, you certainly know more than me. So what do you know about the DIY industry in China and how it's fared over the last couple of years, or how it's shaped in general?
Yeah, so it's been a very difficult industry to tackle China. If I look at many of the big brands in DIY, and that is because there's still a lot of people that are willing to do the job for you. So instead of buying things in a DIY store, you actually ask somebody on the streets, can you fix this for me? And there's still 600 million people in China living below 150, 180 US dollars a month. And so these people are quite handy people. And so they usually do the things for you. And so this whole mastership of learning and teaching others is something that has been around for 2000 years. And so the DIY is struggling a little bit. But of course, with IKEA and other companies that started showing how to put things together yourself, they started slowly moving. And specifically the younger generation is willing to just take it as a challenge to do it themselves rather than pay someone else. It's not a money issue. It's more an issue of, I want to be able to show to people that I've done this. And so, yes.
Do you think there's a culture, a negative culture about doing something yourself? So if you're middle class Chinese,
yes,
there's a negative perception.
There used to be very much, but the younger generation is starting to want to have express their own identity and show that they can do things. And so that is also something you see in retail, in social media, that it's all about not showing up, but basically creating that identity and being very strong around it. And so, yes, they start using DIY because of these reasons. But it's a hard industry because there's still a lot of people doing stuff for you.
Of course. There's another question. I'm going to read it off my screen. From Andre, wants to know, you mentioned TikTok. You mentioned TikTok during the presentation there. Why he wants to know, why is it so successful? Why is TikTok so successful, and how does it impact maybe our industry and the impact of commerce in the future?
I think TikTok has been successful first, both in the West and in China. Many people didn't know it was a Chinese company until Trump started saying that basically they weren't allowed in the US anymore. But it's a company that bases itself both in the Valley as well as in Beijing and even in Shanghai. And so this company understood that you have to localize your products, but the algorithm is actually pretty much the same across the board. And so that is the real power of this company. And it's not so much that they have better algorithms than Facebook or Google or whoever else. It's more that the way they're using this algorithm is quite unique, which means that with Facebook, you just scroll, and when you like something, you watch something. With TikTok, it's the opposite. You get it in your face, basically, and unless you put it away, you have to watch it. And so not doing something actually shows people that you're interested, which is the opposite way of thinking. And so they started creating all these models, which means that they got a lot more information about what people liked. And that means that they could kind of mold the new information to them and stream it directly to them. It became very addictive because of that, just because of this algorithm. It's a technology company, very much, but it's more an addictive product because it's constantly it's like playing ping pong. You constantly have to react.
And I've got two teenagers, trust me. So I know all about the addictive nature of TikTok. But the interesting, you made a point earlier on when you're talking about retail in China. So obviously that's what we're talking about today, and those new trends and what trends would come from China into the West. And you were talking about that merging of social commerce and entertainment and live streaming and gaming. I'm curious as to know how much of that will transfer over and how much of it won't, because of the cultural nuances between how Chinese use gaming and entertainment and interaction and how we as Europeans and in the US do. Any opinions on that one?
Yeah, of course. No, I do believe that some things will go faster than others. Now, I'd like to first say that I think China is about 5 to 10 years ahead of the West when it comes to all this entertainment, social commerce, and lifestyle buying. So they're really far ahead, and that has a lot to do with the social context. But I think the real power of China are the super apps. And unless we have super apps in the West that combine all these things, which combine everything you can do with in your lifestyle, from taking a taxi to buying a movie ticket or just doing some live streaming or buying products on e-commerce, unless you have all that in one application, it's very hard for the West to replicate that. And so what that means is that we will need Amazon and Facebook to work together, but that's not going to likely to happen fast. It could, but we need to partner. While the Chinese have built this conglomerate, this ecosystem in itself. And so I think a lot of things, probably everything will come to the West, but it's going to be slower and it's going to be pockets. If we look at live streaming, it's already very active in the West as well.
Yeah.
But if you look at being able to buy on social media, then create these mini groups with friends of you to get better deals and stuff like that, you don't see that yet.
Yeah, but you think it will come. So you don't think it's a cultural Chinese element. You think it will come. It'll just be 3 or 4 years behind.
Yeah, there's one cultural aspect in China that feeds all this, and that's trust. Chinese trust their friends more than they trust brands or they trust marketing and advertisement. That's why ads is very difficult in China as a business model. You always have to have a commerce as part of it. And so the trust between people is very strong. Because there's distrust if you don't know each other. And so that means that that social aspect is everywhere. Okay. And that is not as strong in the West. Although with the pandemic now, you can see that this is happening too, that people are reaching out again to people they know.
Tie ourselves together, yes. I'm learning loads today, and one of the things I'm learning is I need glasses because I can't read the questions from the screen.
Give you mine.
John Herbert, our colleague who does all the CEO interviews, is just thanking you for your presentation and saying it's one of the best presentations she's ever seen, which I have to agree with, of course. I had a question about cashless. You had you mentioned about the fact they're so far ahead in cashless, and I really take your point that 2008, that leapfrog over PC and laptop. I've never really thought about that before, but you're so right. The minute the mobile went into their hand as the primary device, way before we kind of got to it being the primary device, and so they're so far ahead in that race. But like the sailing example I used earlier on, they're already ready for it. Question is, if they're so far ahead, what can we learn from their cashless journey in Western retail right now? Like, have there been significant cultural changes in commerce because of cashless? Or is it just a convenience thing? Or has there been actually any element where we can think, wow, cashless caused this or cashless caused that in a way that we mightn't have seen?
Yeah, so cashless caused mobility in a different way than we had it in the West, which means that if you use cashless, you constantly see on your screen everything that is happening around you. And so that means that because you pay everywhere, that means that Alibaba and Tencent and all these companies can track your user journey. And once they can track your user journey because of cashless, they can't do that when you use normal cash or even credit cards. That means that they can tailor products and services to that. And that goes back into your phone. And so there's this loop of basically constantly using your phone, and the big companies, the big ecosystems, being able to give you better service. So you're using your phone even more. And that is a snowball effect that you get. And so I think what we can learn there is to look at cashless not as a way of payment, but a way of getting data and a way of knowing what your customer wants, because you can actually understand his journey.
And what is the Chinese average consumer's relationship then with privacy? So obviously, the moment you say that and you say we're looking at your journey, I mean, in the West, we always get the same thing will always be said back to us. The back goes up, and people think, "Hang on, look at my journey." Are Chinese people actually because they're so far ahead of us? Are they absolutely accepting of giving all their data because they know in return they get service?
So that's the perception we have in the West, that Chinese are just don't care about data, and that the government sees it everywhere anyway. So why would they care? So that's the story you always hear. It depends on the generations. But specifically the younger generation, and that's about 35% of the purchasing power in China. These people, they basically care about their privacy. They care about the privacy because you get a lot of advertisements, but not through the social media, but basically people will call you and people will actually try to sell you something, because Chinese are very commercial. So that means that they care about their privacy. The problem was not so much that people didn't care about it, is that the companies were not regulated. And so until 2018, Alibaba, Tencent, they could just grow like crazy and not care so much about all the data. That is finished now. And so now, if you look at privacy, you see that actually the regulation in China is almost as strict as GDPR in Europe. So there's very little difference. So I don't see that as the big difference. I do believe that they have had 5 years of playing time, which means that they leapfrogged because of that.
Ahead of us, I get you. Okay, I have a couple more questions. I mean, we had our inauguration. So Trump is gone, Biden's in.
Yes.
What do you reckon? Will that have any impact on how the US is dealing with China? Do you think in the immediate term?
Yeah, I believe that. I mean, the big there's not going to be a huge change in the way that the West is looking at China, meaning that we're still, I mean, one of the things that Trump did very well is to make everybody aware that China is a challenge and that you need to do something about it. But he also made the world aware that even if you do a lot about it, I mean, you're not going to change China, just like I believe China's not going to change us. And so we have to get back to that relationship. And so one of the challenges that I saw under Trump is that there was no relationship. It was quite dysfunctional blaming game. And it was it was about ideology, about philosophy. It was about communism versus free market and liberal versus control and all these things. And so it was a narrative which was quite offensive towards most of the Chinese. And they fought back in a way that I am also not accustomed to the Chinese culture, which is very weird as well. So we got into this battle. With Biden, I do believe that relationship will get back to normal. And specifically, Biden will work with a lot of allies in the world, which means that they will have a lot more power against China than Trump had on his own. Yes. So that's probably a good thing. And I think important for the West to have that. But I also believe that in the new administration of Biden, where there's a lot of China and Asia experts, they will be much more pragmatic and try to find solutions and try to find ways to coordinate or collaborate in things like think about healthcare, think about saving the planet on sustainability, all these things that also matters for us, and probably be much more aware of how Beijing and how the Communist Party is reading the actions of the West, which Trump didn't care about that much.
Yeah, that's
true. And so I think more sophisticated, which China prefers.
Yes.
But they had the 4 years of Trump actually helped them to go faster.
Yeah, I think the word more sophisticated sums up any replacement of Trump, I'll be honest. You made a very interesting point about the V-shaped recovery. And so I think when the pandemic hit us all back in March, April here in Europe and in the West, we all kind of hoped for our own V-shaped recovery. We were kind of quite foolish, I think, in March, thinking, okay, this will be 6 weeks and it'll be fine. And we, of course, learned that it won't be that. But yeah, that graph you showed was kind of nearly shocking in terms of the pace of their GDP recovery. Other than the fact that, I mean, you just kind of mentioned in your presentation, you know, they opened the factories quite fast. So yes, I understand they got back to production, but any idea of what drove that upward strike of that V shape? Because everyone watching this is certainly interested in that piece. You know, what actually drove that? Okay, we understand they have all the technology in place. They were able to maintain tracking and tracing faster, but economically, how do they achieve it? Any idea how they got to that?
Well, I think one of the big differences that I see between the way that we handled the pandemic and that China did is that it was much more collective in China. What that means is that, and that's something we don't talk often about it, but the relationship between the civilians or people and the government is actually almost a family relationship, which means that they trust each other to help each other when needed. And that's something we don't always understand, coming from a liberal, very individualistic society where we want to have freedom for each of us. They also want that. But when there's a problem, they assume that the government will solve the problem, and they have to take care of it. And so that collectivistic meaning is situation means that they did all the measures possible. And I think one of the big differences between why they had a V-shaped recovery and we have not is really in the way that they don't make choices. We make a lot of choices in the West. We choose, should we choose economy versus health? Should we choose testing versus privacy? I mean, or tracing versus, there's a lot of choices and a lot of debate. In China, it's like, we just do everything. And so if we do everything, then we probably will have it covered, and it's suffering together. And that's something that's 2,500 years old. But that also means that there's kind of like an unwritten promise that if we suffer together, we will recover together.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's, for me, you know, the Western phrase that we heard all the time, no matter what country you're in, you've had your own version of this, you know, we're all in this together.
Yes,
was kind of was an introduced concept nearly into our culture, or into our society. So it was a concept. Whereas what you're saying is that we're all in this together was a culture.
It was a culture part, and it wasn't just the culture from a narrative point of view. There's also the communities, and that goes back to that social retail. the communities are very strong. So if you live in an apartment block in Shanghai or Beijing, then you have these community workers, and they will help you if you need groceries or medicine or whatever you need. They will help you constantly. So that community sense, which we in the West had probably 100, 200 years ago, when we lived around a church or in a small town, that is something China still has, even in an anonymous city like Shanghai or Beijing, and that's quite amazing.
Yeah,
and
I think
yeah,
I think what's interesting about the culture of innovation, when you were talking about earlier on about I think for me the difference between maybe the where Silicon Valley and the West are in terms of innovation and creativity now and where China is, if you talk about disruption, based on what you said today, it seems to me that kind of Western businesses, and maybe even some of us watching this today, are passengers on the disruption bus, in that when disruption comes away, we deal with it. Seems to me that China seems to be driving the disruption bus themselves. So that they're not a passenger on the disruption journey. They're actually so your conversation about 5G, AI, IoT, they're driving that bus. We seem to be more kind of reacting to those disruptions as they come, whereas the Chinese seem to be really running that race. So, for instance, 5G. You mentioned 5G. Why are we so behind? Why are we so behind in the infrastructure of 5G?
Well, because we don't trust it. We always wonder, will 4G still work for a little while longer? So we don't want to reinvest in what we've done before. There's a lot of debate on who owns it and stuff like that. So there's not a collective mindset from this is going to disrupt the future. And so this is what I also say about these 9 big disruptive innovations. China understood that they have to take all 9 steps in order they have to go into digital, they have to go into 5G, they have to go into IoT, into blockchain, into all these things, because everything is rewritten. And when things get rewritten, you can actually leapfrog ahead of anybody else. And I think Silicon Valley had that same mentality a long time ago. I think we just lost it a little bit, meaning that we went on to disrupting through technology and believing, yeah, we'll create that next big thing, that moonshot, like Google says, and then that will change everything. While Chinese are saying, we don't want one big moonshot, we want 1,000 small ones, but we're going to take them all now. And I think that's the big difference. So I think Chinese are disrupting more from a market perspective, and we're disrupting more from a technology perspective. It's more about building something unique, while in China, it's more about building something collective that benefits everyone.
Yeah. Okay. I think one last question for you, and nothing to do really with innovation, creativity. In terms of, you talked about the technology, the track and trace of them dealing with the pandemic, and that's why they drove themselves out of the V quite fast. Any idea of how that technology is being implemented in terms of vaccinations, and where are they on the vaccination? We don't hear much about the vaccination process in China and where they are. We hear all about Pfizer and Moderna and everything in Europe and America. I'm not hearing anything out of China about vaccination. What's going on over there?
I think we're getting censored by the Western media on Chinese vaccination. I have no idea, but I read a lot about it.
Isn't that interesting? You have no idea.
Yeah. So No. I do have an idea. I was saying, but I have no idea why we're getting why we don't get the information. So China actually has created a lot of vaccines. They have about 23 vaccines in phase 3 right now. So there's about 4 that are being used, and we're talking about 600 million vaccines available already today. If you look at where they're going primarily to the southern hemisphere of this planet. So from Turkey to Brazil to Indonesia, these are the big buyers of Chinese vaccines. Okay. We in the West have decided not to buy Chinese vaccines for reasons of I'm not going to go there. But reality is China is far ahead, meaning they're at the same level as Moderna and Pfizer. At the same, they launched it at the same moment.
What I'm curious about, because I think it'll be a beautiful case study in about a year's time to look back on. You talked about their ability in terms of delivery. And the use of technology, so they've got so much layered down in terms of infrastructure, both digitally and delivery, that to vaccinate 1 million people in the UK, or in the Netherlands, or in Spain, or in the US, versus to vaccinate 1 million people in China. I can't wait to see the speed differences. So looking back on how fast they'll get through their population and their systems and using technology, and they've so much in place. They will be able to do it. I mean, how twice as fast, 3 times, 4 times as fast? I have no idea.
Much faster. As long as the vaccines are available, there's actually no bottleneck. But one thing to know about this is important, that they don't have the vaccine nation strategy we have. We are trying to vaccinate as many people as possible to get rid of this virus. In China, they don't have the virus except for a few pockets. So why would they need to vaccinate 1.4 billion people? So they're first going to vaccinate the rest of the world, and then
make the money,
make some money, keep the borders closed, and vaccinate specifically those people who ask it. So in China, it's not so much the government saying these are the priorities. In China, it's about people saying, I want to get vaccinated, and so if you ask for it, you can actually get it. If you don't, you just you can do it whenever you want it. So it's a very different mindset again. So it's more about solving the problem from the roots on, rather than trying to solve it afterwards.
Absolutely.
Something Western and Chinese medicine.
Yeah, well, very different culturally. Listen, Pascal, I've really enjoyed the conversation. We could talk for another 2 hours, you know, and I know that. But people watching this live and on demand need to get back to their lives. So listen, thank you so much for the content today. It was really amazing. Pleasure. I think I'd highly recommend anyone who's watching it to flick it on to your colleagues. I think understanding how different economies and different cultures, and as you said, they're so far ahead of us. There's so much we can learn for what's going to come in the next 5 years for us to deal with in terms of consumer expectations and strategies. So listen, Pascal, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll talk again very, very soon.
Great.
The rest of you, I'm going to read this off my screen because I've just been reminded. I see, God, it's so many glasses. This is ridiculous. I'm just refusing to buy them. Next week we have an interview with Carl Otto. I never always get his name hard. It's Love and Scold interview. Again, always moderated by John Herbert, who does all our CEO interviews. And I gotta say, I've watched a few of them, and they're amazing. So between this online series on innovation and the series that John Herbert's doing, if you could definitely go back, even if you missed a few of them, trust me, go back into a few of them from October, November, December, January. There's a huge amount of content there, and the opinions and of the various CEOs and what they're doing in their countries, how they're dealing with the innovation and 2021 plans. It's fascinating. So do make sure you log into that. As I would say, point you backwards if you haven't looked at some of the previous sessions from October, November, December on this series in terms of webinars. We've had some amazing speakers, and we will continue to have amazing speakers right up until the Growth Summit in 2021, which I will be seeing you hopefully at live. Hope you've enjoyed that conversation. Until next time, I'm Ken Hughes. See you then.